You could see where this is probably going. It's not a happy ending at all. At 28, my father died. I was 28. He was 61. He died in his sleep of a heart attack. Even though he was an attorney and in a second marriage, and his second wife was also an attorney, he did not have a will. Yes. Dun, dun, dun. Wow.
Wow.
Wow. Yes. So it's hard enough when you lose a parent, but if they're not leaving any sort of instruction, that can lead to a very awkward situation.
Welcome to Real Money, Real Life, the podcast where we get real about money and the messy human stuff that comes with it. I'm Linda Grizely, financial educator and your Me Money guide to financial clarity. Each week, we dive into financial concepts and money strategies, but we always tie it back to real life, emotions, mindset, and how money actually shows up day to day. If you're ready for practical tools, mindset shifts, and honest conversations that meet you where you are, not where the world thinks you should be, you're in the right place. Because you deserve to feel confident with your money and good about how you use it. No judgment, no lectures, and definitely no putting yourself last. Hello, everyone. I am Linda Grizely, and if you're listening, you are one of the real ones, the ones brave enough to start conversations that matter even when they feel uncomfortable. Today, we're talking about one of the most important and most avoided money conversations, talking to your parents about their finances. Whether it's planning for long-term care, managing bills, or making sure essential documents are in place, these conversations can feel intimidating. Together, we'll explore why these talks are necessary, how to start them, and what to do if your parents aren't ready to open up. Today's guest is Cameron Huddleston. She is the author of Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk: How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. She's also an award-winning personal finance journalist whose work has appeared in AARP, Kiplinger Personal Finance, Forbes, Yahoo Finance, and many more online and print publications. So welcome, Cameron. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have this conversation because this is always a tough one. I mean, I know me being sandwich generation, taking care of parents and, kids, but even though they might be young adults, is common. And the more people that I talk to, the more I find that that's part of what they're doing. And one of their big struggles is the finances. So I'm so happy to bring this conversation to light. And first, tell me about what inspired you to write this book and talk about this.
I wrote this book because I did not have detailed conversations with my parents soon enough. And so I am the, don't make the same mistake I made. That's why I wrote the book, because I want people to have these conversations sooner rather than later. And here's what happened with my parents. My mom and dad got divorced while I was in college or shortly after college. And I remember my mother telling me that I needed to ask my dad what his final wishes were. She's like, you've got to get it out of him, because every time I asked him, all he would say is, sharpen my toes and hammer me into the ground. And so I'm, in my mid-20s, and I'm thinking, I don't need to have this conversation with my dad. I didn't take my mom's advice. You could see where this is probably going. It's not a happy ending at all. At 28, my father died. I was 28. He was 61. He died in his sleep of a heart attack. Even though he was an attorney and in a second marriage, and his second wife was also an attorney, he did not have a will. Yes. Dun, dun, dun. Wow. Wow. Yes. So it's hard enough when you lose a parent, but if they're not leaving any sort of instructions about how they want their assets managed, how they want them distributed when they die, that can lead to a very awkward situation. I was fortunate. It did not lead to any major fights with my stepmother, my stepbrother, but it was awkward nonetheless. Then a few years later, my mother starts showing signs of memory loss. I had had a conversation with her when she was around 60 or 61 about how she should look into getting long-term care insurance to pay for long-term care if she ever needed it because she was living on her own. She wasn't able to get it because of another pre-existing health condition. And I should have used that opportunity then to have a conversation. Mom, let's sit down and talk about your finances, how you would pay for care if you ever needed it, what type of care you wanted. And I didn't realize, again, how important it was to have that conversation. So I didn't have that conversation. My mom, around 64, starts showing signs of memory loss. She's diagnosed at 65 with Alzheimer's disease. And then we have to scramble to get her estate planning documents updated so that I can be named her power of attorney and I can be named her healthcare surrogate so I can make financial and medical decisions for her. And then I have to play detective essentially to get the information I need about her finances as she herself is forgetting important details. And so this is what prompted me to write this book. I don't want people to be making that same mistake. I don't want people to be waiting until an emergency happens to have these conversations. That is not the time to have the conversation.
Right, absolutely. So tell me more about how you address this in your book. Like, what does it tell people to do?
Well, I start by telling people that, yes, I recognize this is an awkward conversation, and you're probably afraid of having the conversation with your parents. Your parents might not be eager to have the conversation with you. I tell people to consider the reasons why your parents might be reluctant to have the conversation, because that's going to help you know kind of what approach to take when you're starting the conversation. For example, if your parents are like my dad, who then they don't want to think about death, because that was clearly what was going on with my father. Sharpen my toes, hammer me into the ground. His response to thinking about death was making a joke about it and not having any sort of plan, because maybe he thought he was going to live forever. We know that's not going to happen. But if you know that your parents are uncomfortable talking about death, don't start the conversation by asking them about, do they have a will? Do they have a trust? Do they have a plan? Find another way to have the conversation. If you know that your parents perhaps are ashamed about their finances because they haven't done a good job of planning for retirement, then you don't want to start by asking them, Mom and Dad, how's retirement going? Or Mom and Dad, what's your plan for retirement? How are you going to pay for retirement? You want to find another way to start the conversation. Don't start it in a way that's going to lead to them shutting down. I tell people they need to talk to their siblings before they even have a conversation with their parents, because you and your siblings need to get on the same page. You need to decide who's going to start the conversation. Is it one of you? Is it all of you? When do you want to have the conversation? And I tell people, don't do it during a holiday meal, even if everyone's there. This is not the best time to have a conversation. There could be other people there who don't need to be part of the conversation. Of course, if anyone's had anything to drink, the conversation is going to go downhill pretty rapidly. Find another time to have that conversation. And then I give people a variety of ways to start the conversation naturally. And I explain all the different pieces of information you need to gather. I talk about what is an estate plan, what's a will or a trust, what's power of attorney, what's healthcare power of attorney, what's an advance directive, which is also called a living will. I explain all those things. I explain how to plan for long-term care and what sort of information you need to get from your parents. I tell people how to talk to your parents about scams and how to avoid being taken advantage of. And so I try to provide as much information as possible in very simple terms that anyone can understand, because, let's face it, a lot of us, we don't know a lot about managing our own finances. So trying to talk to our parents about their finances is going to seem especially awkward, because it's a role reversal. If we don't feel comfortable talking about the topic, how do we broach it with our parents? And so I try to break everything down for people in the simplest way possible.
That sounds great. And I think going back to what you said, like, don't do it at a holiday, find a better time. But I also want to say, like, there's never like the perfect time. Just like so many things in life, like you just have to make the time for it. You have to make it a priority, because it will make your life so much easier during that time when you should be mourning and you should be, planning service or whatever it is that you need to do, and not worried about all these other things that make everything so complicated. So I agree. It is so important. And so you gave us some examples of, what happened with you after not talking about money. Do you have other stories in your book, or stories you can share about people that maybe have had, have not had these conversations before a crisis hit?
I do. So I have one entire chapter dedicated to, well, I should not say dedicated, but it's about a man named Doug Nordman. He was living in Hawaii. His father was living alone in Colorado. And while he was visiting his dad once, he was noticing some changes in his dad's behavior, some potential changes in his memory. And he had suggested while he was visiting his dad that his dad ought to make sure he had a power of attorney. And let me explain to you quickly what that is, or to your listeners. So a power of attorney is a legal document. That doesn't mean that you have to be an attorney. It's a good idea to work with an attorney, an estate planning attorney, or an elder law attorney to draft this document. But a power of attorney lets you name an agent, someone you trust, to make financial decisions and transactions for you if you can't. And this document has to be drafted and signed while you're still mentally competent. So if mom has had a stroke, can no longer speak for herself, it's too late to get that power of attorney document signed. Now, if dad is showing signs of memory loss, that doesn't necessarily mean it's too late. As I mentioned, my mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but she was still in the early stage and was still competent to sign that document. The attorney talked with her, determined that she understood what she was signing, and we got lucky in that regard. Because if you wait too long and you are no longer of sound mind, and there is no power of attorney document naming someone you trust to make decisions for you, then what will happen, and what happened in the case of Doug, is that when his father ended up being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, ended up in the emergency room and then a nursing home for rehabilitation, Doug had not been named his dad's power of attorney. Because his father, when they had that conversation, had said, oh, no, we don't need to worry about this right now. And so bills start rolling in while his dad is in the hospital and then the skilled nursing facility, and Doug can't pay them because Doug does not have access to his dad's bank account. Doug is not authorized to sign checks for his father. And the bank doesn't even want to talk to Doug because Doug has not been named his dad's power of attorney. So Doug spent 9 months and more than $10,000 going through the court process to be named his dad's conservator. And essentially what you're doing is putting your loved one on trial to prove that they're no longer capable of managing their finances, or, in some cases, managing their own health care. And $10,000, really, he got off easy. This was several years ago when I interviewed Doug. Sometimes people can pay $15,000, $20,000 or more because you're hiring an attorney for yourself. You're hiring an attorney for the parent to represent the parent. You've got to get doctors to come in and testify that the person is no longer competent. This can be avoided by simply meeting with an elder law or estate planning attorney and having that power of attorney document drafted. Now, if you're having this conversation with your parents and they're like, well, I'm doing fine, why do I want to give you that sort of power now? What you can say is, look, mom and dad, the only way for me to actually have real power is to have that document in my hands. I've got to have the document, show it to the bank, show it to your brokerage, show it to any financial institution that I need access to, show it to your insurers, your credit cards. What I suggest that you do, mom and dad, is get that document drafted. Go ahead and reach out to your financial institution. Sign any paperwork that they require to let them know that you've named me as your agent under power of attorney. But if you want, put it someplace safe and simply tell me how to access it and when I can access it. For example, if you have a stroke, if you've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, if there's some other reason that we can agree on in advance that you are no longer capable of managing your finances on your own, then at that point, I'm allowed to access that document and start making financial decisions for you. You also need a medical power of attorney, someone to make medical decisions for you. And I think these documents, honestly, are more important than that will or trust, which is going to spill out who gets what when you die. Because like I said, without them, if there is an emergency, you can't just log onto your parents' bank account legally. You can't sign a check for your parents legally. You can't file tax returns. You can't talk to their health insurer. You can't do anything without that document. And you're going to spend a lot of money, and it's going to be a huge headache to go through the court process to be named their conservator. And so that's a worst case scenario of what can happen if you don't have these conversations.
Yeah, that's a unfortunately common story. So I'm going to share my story if you don't mind. So,
Yes.
and it's actually a good story in a way. I say in a way because it has a tragedy in it, but it was because I had all of these documents in order for my dad. So my dad, I am now a single child. I wasn't originally, but I'm the only living child. So it was a little easier because I didn't have siblings to bring together to have this conversation with him. It was just me. And so it was easy because I was a financial planner and I said, "Hey dad, I want to be sure you have your stuff in order. I want to be sure I know." And he was open to it. And we redid, in April of 2021, we redid all of his documents. And so we redid his will, his trust, his power of attorney, and his medical power of attorney. We redid it all. And I actually created at that time a separate trust because I'm also in a blended marriage. So we wanted to be sure that his stuff would pass to my kids and not to my husband, my current husband. So we set that all up in April of 2021, not thinking that we would, you never think that you're going to need it. In August of 2021, I got that phone call. We have who we think is your dad. We're not even sure. He's been in an accident. He's alive. But he's in a coma and, we need you to come here and tell us if this is him. It took me 11 hours to get there, through various forms of transportation. But when I got there, he had had a brain injury and he had been airlifted there and they weren't sure if he was going to live or not. But as things happened, the first thing that happened was the doctors were talking to me and they were talking about what do we do if, and they're giving me information, but they're being hesitant on what they're telling me. And I say, I understand that you're hesitant on what you're telling me because I'm his daughter. But I have a power of attorney. And they're like, "You do?" And I was like, "Yes." And you could see this doctor's eyes light up. So I handed him the power of attorney. It needed 2 doctors' signatures to sign off on it. So they had the medical doctor and the psychologist or whatever was the brain person. I don't know what he was, but they had them both sign off on it. And then they were open and freely talking to me. So they weren't even ready to talk to me. I'm the only person. I'm the one that's there. And they're still hesitant to tell me things because they don't want to cross those HIPAA lines, right? They don't know. I'm just standing there saying I'm his daughter and they don't really know. And then while he was in the hospital, I was able to go to his house. I was able to go take care of his car, sign over title to his car that was totaled to whatever company that just takes them. I was able to, pay bills and do everything. Now, I'll come back to the paying bills and the bank account thing in a minute, but I was able to do all of that. Not only that, once he was out, I was able to buy a condo for him closer to me, get him moved, sell his house. I did all of this with my power of attorney. If I didn't have that, I have no idea how any of this would have gotten done. It would have been a disaster. And you're right. I would have been spending my money to get things done instead of his, right? So that is my success story, as much as it can be when you have a tragedy involved. But I also want to say that my dad did put me on his bank accounts, and we knew that going in. we were that this was a whole separate issue. But because I was an only child, and because neither one of us had anything that we felt like we would get sued for or anything, we didn't feel like there was a danger. But I want to bring up that it's not necessarily a good idea to put your children on your bank accounts, especially when you have multiple children, because there's all kinds of issues that come about that. So I just wanted to throw that little tidbit in there. But yeah, there are so many stories out there, and I feel like that, nobody likes to talk about accident or death or tragedy, but it needs to happen. Because there are so many things that just happen unexpectedly. That's why they're called accidents. So I want to, with me, like I said, I was the only child, and it made sense for me to talk to my dad about it, and it came up in a natural way. But for others that have siblings or their parents aren't as open to talking about it, how do you break the ice? How do you start that conversation?
So there are a variety of ways you can start the conversation in a natural way. So you could share a story. Mom and Dad, I was listening to this podcast the other day, and there were two women talking, and one of them was talking about how, you know, her father died without a will, and it created a lot of issues for her family. And the other woman was talking about how her father had updated all of his documents, and it was a real lifesaver for her when there was a tragedy. So you can use a story. You can ask your parents for advice. This avoids that role reversal. I often say that this is a really easy way to do it if you're young, but it still works, I think, if you are middle age, because, this is what parents love doing. They love giving their kids advice, even if their kids are 50 years old. So you could say something like, Mom and Dad, I'm getting closer to, retirement, maybe 10 or 15 years down the road. I'm kind of curious, you know, what what steps were you taking at this point? Their response is going to give you insight into what sort of planning they've done. And then you're going to ask more questions. If you're young, for example, Mom and Dad, now that I have kids, should I have a will? Should I have life insurance? Again, their answers are going to tell you what sort of planning they've done, and you're going to ask more questions. And if they happen to say, well, I don't know if you should have a will because I don't have one myself. So then you could turn it into a family project of sorts. You know what? Maybe this is something that we could do together. Maybe I can find an attorney who can meet with all of us. Then we can kind of work on this together. We'll know what each other's plans are. That's one thing that you can do. You can talk about something that anyone could experience, and that's scams. Any of us could be a target of a scammer at any point. And so if your parents are really reluctant to talk about money, it's going to be probably the easiest way to start that conversation, either talking about scams or ways to save money. Mom, I found this great new app to save money at the grocery store to get cash back. If they're into saving money, they're pinching pennies in retirement. Or, I just got this phone call the other day, someone claiming to be with the IRS, telling me that they were going to audit me or send me to jail if I didn't make a payment right away with a gift card. This is a scam. Send them emails, with articles about scams you heard about. It's kind of a way to open the door and get them comfortable talking about the topic of money, and maybe from there you could say, it's a really good idea to make sure that you have placed a security freeze on your credit reports in case your personal information is linked. Then bad guys cannot use your information to open lines of credit in your name. Let me show you how to do that. By the way, Mom and Dad, have you ever, how are you paying your bills? Are you taking advantage of automatic bill payments? You could ask them if something happened, if there was an emergency, how could I make sure your bills got paid? There are a lot of different ways to have this conversation naturally. But here's the thing. If one way doesn't work, don't give up. Give it a little time, try again. Sometimes it can take quite a while to get through to reluctant parents. I have a friend who's a financial planner. It actually took several years of trying to finally get her mom to even let her know whether she had estate planning documents. But once that door is opened, then you can start pushing your way in a little more at a time. And the thing is, the earlier you start trying to have this conversation, the better, because if you do have parents who are reluctant to talk and it does take several months, several years, you're going to need that time, especially the older they are. You don't want to risk the chance that something happens before you have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, there are some parents, let's talk about like the mindset obstacles, right? To me, I'll give my few tidbits of mindset obstacles, then you can tell me what other ones you can think of. But I know that some parents are like, this is none of your business. Like, this is my business, and they don't want their kids to know anything. Sometimes they have money that they don't want their kids to know about. But I think the important thing to say is that it is my business because I'm the one who's going to be doing it when you're gone, right? And I don't need to know it all now. I just need to know that you have everything that I need in a place that I know where to find it when it's time, because there is going to be a time, right?
Yes.
So I think that's one thing where it's like, this is none of your business. Why are you asking me this? Like, you don't need to know this. Another one is, I don't care. I'll be gone. I've heard people say that too. Like, I don't care. Do whatever you want. I'll be gone. Doesn't matter to me. But it's like, well, do you care about me? Because what you're saying right now is, if you're not doing anything, that's going to just put a lot of burden and a lot of work on me that is completely unnecessary. So I think those are the two things that I've seen. What other ones do you think, like emotional barriers or just mindsets that people have?
A lot of it comes down to control and not wanting to give up control. And parents see this as giving up control. It kind of gets back to, this is none of your business, but it's more than that, because when you're having these conversations, when you're sharing this information, what you're essentially doing is admitting that there will come a time in your life where you might no longer be in control. And that's scary. No one wants to think about having to give up control. And so one of the things that you can say is, really, mom and dad, I want you to stay in control. I want these decisions to be your decisions, not mine. I don't want to have to make these decisions for you. I don't want to have to decide whether to keep you on life support. I don't want to decide whether I should be the one to manage your finances if something happens to you. I don't want to be fighting with my siblings in court over who gets what when you're no longer here. These are your decisions. And the only way that I can know what your wishes are is if you tell me and if you put it in writing so that there's no question about what you want. I want to be able to honor those wishes, but I've got to know what they are. And, again, like, please don't make me make these decisions for you, because I don't want to make the wrong decision. You've worked hard to save for retirement. You've worked hard to create this investment portfolio. Let's make sure that your hard work is protected by giving me the information that I need to carry out the plans that you've put in place. And so again, just focusing on that control. So let me give you a good example of what can happen when parents don't share with their kids information about their finances. It's something you could always tell your parents is a reason why they should share a little bit of information, because when your kids don't know details, then all that hard work that you've put into creating this plan, that you put into investing, well, if your kids don't know what accounts you have, those accounts can go missing. And I say this from personal experience. Again, like I said, I had to play detective to get information about my mom's finances. I had a general idea when I started getting involved, but really I had to put together the pieces of her financial picture by looking at her tax returns, going through her mail. But there was a brokerage account that I didn't even know existed until we got a letter stating that it was going to be turned over to the state as an unclaimed asset because of inactivity. And this account was worth $50,000. So I almost lost $50,000 of my mom's money In fact, it wasn't that easy for me to gain access to it. Even as her power of attorney, I had to jump through a lot of extra hoops to get access to that one. And once I did, I was like, all right, this is it. We're cashing out this one and I'm putting it somewhere else and I can use it to pay for her care. But I can't imagine, like, if I had discovered, after the fact, years later, after she had died somehow, that there was this $50,000 that I had, essentially let slip through my fingers just because I didn't know it existed. And this can happen when parents aren't willing to share information with their kids. The kids aren't going to know what sort of accounts they have to pay for things, to pay for their care, to pay for long-term care, and when you pass away, they're going to have to dig through your stuff if you don't have it neatly organized for them, and all these things that maybe you were trying to hide for them. I mean, your kids are going to find out. And at that point, you can't explain to them the decisions you made. You can't explain why, maybe you wanted to leave more money to one kid than the other. You can't explain why you never told them, what sort of investments you have. They're just going to be left to guess, and they might think the worst. They might assume the worst.
Yeah. Wow. Great information. So if there's one key takeaway that you want listeners to remember, what is it?
That these conversations have to happen sooner rather than later. And as awkward as they might seem, truly the consequences of not having these conversations will be a lot more awkward. It's going to be a lot more difficult. And it's going to be difficult for both you and your parents. If you're having to get involved in a caregiving situation, it's going to be very difficult for you and other family members when your parents pass away and there's no plan or you don't know any details. And, like you said earlier, you're grieving. The last thing you want to do is play detective. It's hard enough trying to settle an estate, even if it's a very small estate. I mean, there are debts sometimes that have to be paid. There's, property that has to be distributed. Even if there's not a lot, it's still not easy, even when you have all the information you need. And so if you don't have any information, it's just that much harder, and so tell your parents, please think of this as a gift to me.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so maybe it's obvious, but people need to go find your book, Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk, How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. That will help them get started, right? Who needs to find you, and where can they find you?
So the easiest way to find me is at my website, which is CameronHuddleston.com. I've got some free resources there. I've got this in case of emergency organizer that you could share with your parents, or you could print it out and give to them. Because one thing I often suggest is that if your parents don't want to tell you information about their finances, they might be willing to write it down, and you can just ask them to put it someplace safe and tell you how to access it. I've got a scam red flag sheet that you can print out, leave it on the kitchen counter for your parents. Maybe it'll lead to a conversation, or just say, hey, I thought this would be useful, hang it on their fridge, hang it up by the phone. And so there are some free resources there on my site.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So I think that if I could give one takeaway also from my perspective, is that you don't have to have the whole talk in one sitting.
No.
Right. So, start opening up the conversation, and even one small question can open the door to a bigger conversation. So that was great advice that you gave. So if you're still here, you're one of the real ones, and that matters. And today I have an invitation for you. I am building a community. So if you are a woman or anyone who feels like they're behind on their finances and just wants to know more or thinks they should know more by now, please join me. It's a space for real talk, fresh starts, and women who are done putting themselves last. Check this episode's description or my website for details, lindagrizely.com. Thanks so much for being with me today, Cameron.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Real Money, Real Life. Want to see what's blocking you from financial confidence or discover your money personality? Head to the resources page at lindagrizely.com for our free quizzes. That's LINDAGRIZ.com/resources. If you're loving what you're learning, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. I'm your Me Money Guide to Financial Clarity, Linda Grizely, and I'll catch you next time as we talk more real money, real life. because you deserve to feel confident with your money and good about how you spend it. The content shared here is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not financial, tax, legal, or planning advice and does not constitute therapy or mental health counseling. Please consult an actively licensed and qualified professional for advice or help specific to your situation.